The New York City District Attorney's Office is one step closer to decriminalizing prostitution. Manhattan District Attorney Cyrus Vance announced Wednesday his office will no longer prosecute prostitution or what it calls unlicensed massage cases. Prosecutors will keep going after people who solicit sex workers or commit crimes related to sex trafficking. The DA's office also plans to drop nearly 6,000 related cases dating back to the 1970s. Another district attorney's office in Queens plans to follow suit. Vance likely has some support from the public. A 2019 Data for Progress poll shows more than half of voters support decriminalizing sex work. With me now for more is Kimberly Mehlman-Orozco. Kimberly is a human trafficking expert witness, and she is also the author of Hidden in Plain Sight: America's Slaves of the New Millennium. So, Kimberly, in practical terms, what does decriminalizing prostitution mean?
So I think most people might think of it as a step towards legalization, but it is very different. Legalization means that it's legal, it's permissible, it's okay to do. Decriminalization, on the other hand, essentially means it's still illegal, but they're choosing not to prosecute it. They're going to use more discretion in when and under what circumstances they choose to investigate it. And so essentially this step towards decriminalization means that it will still be illegal, but it's not going to be necessarily a prosecutorial offense where they're going to pursue prosecution.
I want to dig a little bit deeper into decriminalization versus legalization. Is one better for sex workers? Is one safer? And why is New York City going to the route of decriminalization rather than legalization?
I think that's an excellent question. There is some research that actually does suggest that when you legalize sex work, you do see an uptick in sex trafficking cases. There's this idea that if you legalize it, it's going to replace the illicit market. But in fact, we've seen an expansion where places have legalized it, and these sex trafficking cases have continued to continue under the veneer of being a illicit exchange. Decriminalization, on the other hand, it is, I think, a step in the right direction. It's supported by Amnesty International, and it essentially is allowing for consenting adult sex work to continue without prosecution, but it's empowering these women who are engaging in sex work to come forward when and if they're being victimized. So if a sex worker is violently victimized or even sex trafficked, she's not necessarily going to report it if it's illegal because she's going to fear criminalization. And we actually have seen many victims of trafficking being criminalized, being arrested, being prosecuted for things like prostitution. And that's why over 50% of states have vacator statutes. So by decriminalizing it, it's empowering these women to come forward when and if they are violently victimized or victimized in any way without fear of prosecution. And I think that that doesn't have that same expansion effect as legalization. So I think it is a step in the right direction.
You mentioned sex trafficking, and not all people working in the sex industry are there voluntarily. So how is decriminalizing prostitution linked to the fight against sex trafficking?
So I think that most people, when they think of sex trafficking, they're thinking of something out of the movie Taken, where you have a clearly innocent victim, you have these gun-wielding mobsters that are physically kidnapping her, but that's not how it happens in real life. In real life, it's much more clandestine, and it's difficult to identify. It's difficult to identify somebody who's sex trafficked from somebody who is consenting because of the mental manipulation, the trauma bonding, the coercion, the deceptions that's involved with that exploitation. And so I think some of the challenges with decriminalization, in particular, for example, in the illicit massage industry, it's about identifying who is there, by their own will, by their own volition and agency, and who's being exploited. And so with regards to the prevalence of sex trafficked persons within the commercial sex industry, it's very hidden. There aren't a lot of reliable data on that. But I would say the majority of sex workers are not being trafficked from the research that I've seen. They are not being trafficked. They are consenting persons. But those who are being trafficked, again, it's very difficult to discern who's consenting from who's not without some form of investigation. So I think one of the challenges of decriminalization is, when and under what circumstances do you investigate, do you explore further if this person is truly consenting or not?
Sex workers often do not report abuse that they face while working or during arrests. Walk us through some of the dangers that sex workers face and tell us how the justice system has further enforced this problem.
Sex workers are at high risk of all types of victimization, from rape and sexual assault to robbery to physical abuse. And because of the nature of the industry, of it being illicit, they are sometimes afraid to report those victimizations to law enforcement. These women are also at high risk of being trafficked. Traffickers, essentially, they try to exploit whatever void an individual has in their life. So with regards to sex trafficked persons, consenting sex workers, they're saying, well, I'll provide you protection. I will help you and protect you from other forms of abuse, for example, from commercial sex consumers. So I think by empowering them, by decriminalizing them in a way that empowers them to come forward and report these victimizations to law enforcement, I think you are actually kind of undermining some of the tools that traffickers use to lure them into exploitable situations.
District Attorney Cy Vance also noted that people of color and the LGBTQ community are disproportionately impacted by the policing of sex workers. What causes this discrepancy?
It is something that has been endemic in the commercial sex industry for a very long time. Even the origins of sex trafficking, it was born out of this idea of quote unquote white slavery. The first anti-sex trafficking laws that we saw were called white slavery laws, where white women were predominantly viewed as victims while women of color were viewed as criminals and treated as such. So I think that by decriminalizing it, I think it's helping further protect marginalized communities. But we still see that to this day with who's considered a victim, who is considered an offender, with the criminalization of these laws with regards to persons of color, but also other marginalized communities like LGBTQ populations. They're at high risk of being victimized in a number of different ways and engaging sometimes in survival sex and other ways to make ends meet. So I think with regards to the racialization and the disproportionate policing, I think you're by decriminalizing it, you're putting these populations on more of an even playing field with others who are treated as either victims or treated as consenting participants that have the agency to make these choices.
Kimberly, you said earlier in this interview that legalization in your research tends to lead to increased consumption, increased sex trafficking. What will decriminalization? What will be the effects, I guess, of decriminalization in New York City of prostitution and sex working?
I think that remains to be seen. It depends on how they're going to be implementing this idea of decriminalization and when and under what circumstances they're going to further inquire into the consenting nature of a commercial sex exchange. So I think, for one, it likely will empower women who are engaged in commercial sex to come forward with other forms of more serious abuse, violence, and victimization that they experience, reporting that and getting those dangerous persons in the criminal justice system and hopefully convicted of the crimes that they've been committing. But as far as what impact it will have for sex trafficked persons, I think there will be a veneer of legitimacy, and I think you might see an uptick until they figure out how to discern a consenting participant, somebody who is an adult, who is making the agency, who has the agency in making the choice to engage in the commercial sex exchange with another adult, from somebody who's potentially a minor or who is being forced, defrauded, coerced, or deceived into an exploitable position. With regards to sex trafficking, we need to remember it really is a modern form of slavery, but it's involving coercion, deception, and things that are much more difficult to discern from simply looking at somebody or asking them, are you being victimized? Are you being exploited? Many times victims of trafficking don't even perceive themselves as an exploited person, as a victim, until they better understand what's going on and more holistically understand how they're being exploited. So I think that the district attorney is going to face a number of challenges to protect victimized persons who are sex trafficked and discern them from consenting adult sex workers. But I think it's going to be a long road ahead.
Kimberly, I think that's such an important point, because even in having this conversation, it's a bit difficult because there are very big differences between those groups that are being exploited and ones who are doing so voluntarily. Kimberly Mehlman-Orozco, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.